Welcome to episode 25 of When Safeguarding Fails, the Lizzie Gladwell Crisis, the final chapter in this series. I'm Jeremy Gladwell, Lizzie's dad. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search, and a time to give up. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear, and a time to mend. A time to be silent, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. What could we have done differently? How might we have prevented this horror? One day after her 18th birthday, Lizzie, a young person with special needs, diagnosed with alcohol-induced prenatal brain damage and an IQ in the intellectual disability range, was driven away by Coral, with none of her possessions. If Coral's plan had gone smoothly, Lizzie would not even have been able to say goodbye to her mum and dad. Lizzie was then systematically isolated, cut off from her loved ones and support network. Legally, Lizzie was an adult, but in every meaningful way she was a child, in her thinking, understanding and cognitive capacity. What should we have done differently to avert the crisis we've endured for a year and a half, and counting? This matters, because if it happened to us, it could happen to anyone with a child with similar needs. When Coral was executing her pre-planned removal of Lizzie outside our house, the police officer who attended asked us, "Do you have a court of protection order?" Should we have had one? Maybe. Would it have helped? Maybe. But I'm not convinced. It might have helped on that day with a police officer there. It might have delayed Coral's scheme, but not for long. All Coral would need to do would be to try again on a different day, or wait at Linkage College, or around the corner from our house. Once Coral persuaded Lizzie to get in the car, the same sequence of events would have unfolded. Whether it happened on that day, the next day, the following week or month. I am convinced of that. But we will never know. Fundamentally, though, I am resolute that we should not have needed to apply for a court of protection order just to prevent our daughter from being groomed, taken, isolated and exploited. That would be like saying to a man whose house was hit by a meteorite that he was foolish for not taking measures to protect his house from a meteor. The real question isn't whether we should have applied for a court of protection order. It's whether what happened to us means that every parent of a child with special needs should apply for one. Is it truly necessary for every parent of a young person with such vulnerabilities to go through the courts to secure legal decision-making powers? the parent of every young person with autism, Asperger's, FASD, ADHD, or Down syndrome, everyone with an intellectual impairment. Where do you draw the line? Should there be a threshold based on IQ, covering any child struggling at school, or all children in the bottom set? Should all these parents queue to apply for a court of protection order for their children to guard against predatory removal once they turn 18? Is that sensible or feasible? Is it viable, considering the fees for applying and maintaining such an order run into thousands of pounds? It sounds plainly ridiculous to me. I mentioned in episode 1 that we decided against applying for a court of protection order because we wanted to develop Lizzie's independence through wise decision making, not strip her autonomy with legal mechanisms. I stand by that. Currently, we live in a society where someone can drive off with a young person with special needs the day after they turn 18, and our experience shows that statutory agencies don't give a damn. Even more concerning, those same agencies will actually collude with the perpetrator and act as guard dogs, facilitating the exploitation. That cannot be right. It just can't be right. I have to warn people. That is why I have created this podcast. It happened to us and our child. I don't want it to happen to anyone else. Should we have simply refused to let Lizzie go? Should we have clung on to her, dragged her into the house and locked the door? That might have worked for a day or two, but it would have only played into Coral's hands, painting her as a saviour, while we became the villains in our daughter's eyes. Then we would have needed to watch Lizzie's every move, follow her everywhere, and relentlessly message her. No, because then we would have become the bad guys. That was never how our relationship with Lizzie was, and it is not how I would ever want it to be. Our relationship with Lizzie was never about control. It was built on trust and love. Should we have filed a civil case against Coral? Why? Because the agencies refused to act? Gary Atkinson suggested I pursue a private lawsuit against Coral when he had been assigned to the case for less than a month. Such a civil case would be for coercive control of a vulnerable and impressionable young person. But that's illegal. So why would we need to instigate proceedings in the civil court? Are the statutory agencies now so complacent and ineffectual that they are recommending people take private action? I want the agencies to do their job, safeguard my daughter, and uphold the law. Should we go to the Ombudsman or initiate a judicial review? I don't want to fight this out in court, facing a ridiculous battle with monolithic agencies who would know exactly how to grind me down. They are capable of crushing people financially, mentally, and emotionally because they've become adept at it. They've had to. Think of the sub-postmasters who ended up in jail, the Hillsborough campaigners who were maligned, and the relatives of grooming gang victims who were dismissed. Meanwhile, Lizzie remains in that house, and nobody in officialdom cares. We don't want to fight, argue, or complain. We simply want the agencies to do their job. That's all we've ever wanted. However, they have refused to have even one face-to-face meeting with us. Ever. We are not alone. In November 2024, a report was released detailing findings of the research project conducted by the Nuffield Foundation, the Anne Craft Trust, and Nottingham University. It highlighted how adults with cognitive impairments are at high risk of exploitation and often failed by statutory agencies. That report was called Exploitation of Adults with Cognitive Impairment in England. Significant findings included: victims are often stigmatised and blamed for making poor life choices, with agency practitioners showing a lack of professional curiosity. Victim-blaming language was sometimes used. Victims and their families with lived experience were able to identify mistreatment, but felt they were not listened to and not taken seriously. Service providers sometimes used mental capacity assessments to justify disengaging with adults by claiming they had the capacity to make choices. However, they often overlooked coercion's impact on the individual's actual ability to choose or act on decisions. There was little focus on perpetrators or efforts to ensure justice for exploitation victims. Such findings describe our own experience with alarming clarity. How is it possible for a young person with a formal diagnosis of cognitive impairment caused by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, to be taken from her family and isolated, her plight ignored by official agencies? They claim to have acted properly. I would ask Focus Adult Social Care, have you met with us, Lizzie's mum and dad? Have you met with anyone in Lizzie's family or support network? Did your assessment of Lizzie's capacity include those with lived experience of her, or professionals with expertise in her specific diagnosis? The answer is no, on all counts. To Humberside Police, I ask, have you conducted any formal interviews? Have you reviewed the evidence file we submitted as proof of the coercive control Lizzie faces? Has any action been taken against Coral to manage the perpetrator according to your own official guidance? Again, the answer is no on all counts. What happened on July 21st, 2023 felt indistinguishable from a kidnapping or abduction for Jane and me. That's how I described it then, and it still feels that way today. Lizzie's absence feels like death to us. How is it not? How else can it be described? We cannot see her, phone, speak to, visit, or meet with her. We do not know if she's alive or dead. To all intents and purposes, it is no different from her being dead. How can Adult Social Care and Humberside Police be so callous as to dismiss this level of grief across a whole family, offering no support or compassion in the face of such human desperation? How can they be so incompetent and negligent, dismissing Lizzie's special needs and diagnosis, and deliberately ignoring clear evidence of coercive and controlling behaviour? My heart grieves for my relationship with Lizzie. I don't know how she is. I can only hope she is being treated well. I fear that she is forgetting us, her own parents. How can the so-called professionals fail to grasp the cruel manipulation that has taken place to groom a vulnerable child, extract them from their family, and isolate them by means of punishment, threats, and technological intervention? Jane and I have not seen Lizzie for over a year. Not because we don't want to see her, nor because she doesn't want to see us, but because Coral doesn't want Lizzie to see us. Lizzie hasn't seen her maternal grandparents for even longer, not because they don't want to see her or because Lizzie doesn't want to see them, but because Coral doesn't want Lizzie to see them. We, along with others, are blocked on Lizzie's devices for the same reason. It's not us, it's not Lizzie, it's externally imposed. We asked the police to consider this in their questioning, moving beyond superficial inquiries about Lizzie's well-being. We have hoped for policing that is intelligent and logical, rather than taking the easiest path without alertness or astuteness. This is no longer about us and Lizzie. Coral thinks she has won, and she may have, because alarmingly, this podcast actually provides a blueprint for predators to groom, remove, isolate, coerce, manipulate, and exploit a vulnerable young adult. This podcast is a guide to how, in modern Britain, it is possible to enjoy significant financial gain from the benefit system, with the full backing and blessing of social services, the police, and the Department of Work and Pensions. As I said earlier, this cannot be right. I know that. You know that. Everybody knows that. All except... I've made my point. Something has got to change. Safeguarding of vulnerable adults has got to mean something in practice beyond the theory. The first step in that process is demonstrating just how broken the current system is. I hope this podcast helps in that regard. Please continue to share our story to warn others and to alert parents of young people with special needs to be vigilant for signs of grooming or suspicious behaviour that may be predatory. If you are considering applying to the Court of Protection, then do so. It might be what prevents the police from waving your loved one off in the predator's car. I would like to thank many people for walking this traumatic journey with us. Thanks to our church family for their love, prayers and practical support. Thomas Scrimshaw for his advice and efforts with agencies. FASD Network UK and FASD Hub Southwest for their encouragement and awareness-raising efforts. This podcast shows there is still much work ahead. Thank you to the Rock Foundation for their dynamic intervention. My family, Jane's family, Lizzie's godparents, and everyone who has listened in horror or shared our story. Those ready to share Lizzie's experiences with adult social care, or the police, even though the agencies failed to ask. to strangers turned friends from the podcast exploring legal changes holding agencies accountable. Special thanks to Jane for supporting my creative freedom in making this podcast. I appreciate those moved by the Lizzie Gladwell crisis who shared their own painful experiences of unyielding agencies. To God for granting me the determination to get through to this point. And thank you, dear listener, for your attention thus far. I close my podcast series with a message for Lizzie. Recorded in the summer of 2024, when it became clear that the agencies had decided to do nothing. They were not going to conduct a single formal interview with anyone, nor even look at the evidence we had presented. To my precious daughter, what can I say? Now it's too late. I can tell you the obvious, that I'm sorry, but I tried. I can tell you how sorry I am, that it ate me up, that I wish I'd known when we chased around the village or watched Timmy time together, that there wasn't much time left for those bright and silly occasions. I could tell you that even when you were silent, I tried, even though it felt hopeless. I wasn't going to quit. That is why I pushed. I tried to see you. I argued with the agencies, because I'm your dad, and it is my responsibility to protect you from harm. There is no expiry date to that promise. Though others failed in their duty to protect vulnerable individuals because they are hired hands, I could not neglect my own solemn and heartfelt pledge to you, my child, and will sacrifice myself to save you from those who only wish to exploit you. But what I really want you to know is that the hardest thing was living through a time when we could have turned this around. But the safeguarders and law enforcers just ignored it as if it didn't matter. There will be 1,000 explanations for this, each agency blaming the other, or us, or you. Each explanation is a feeble excuse, and all the while, you drifted further and further from our outstretched arms. There were times when we could have reached you, we really could, and you wanted to reach us. But those whose official duty is to protect the vulnerable exerted their power to keep you from us. We cannot begin to explain why they made such cruel decisions, my child. Why they were so unwilling to lift a finger to take meaningful action. Why they chose to block their ears and shut their eyes. We don't know. But I do want to tell you that I am sorry, and I tried. Your dad.